Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a journey through time, a journey through the rich and fascinating history of America. From the arrival of the first indigenous peoples over 12,000 years ago, to the birth of a new nation in 1776, to the challenges and triumphs of the modern era, America's story is one of courage, innovation, and perseverance. It is a story of explorers and adventurers who braved the unknown, of revolutionaries who fought for freedom and equality, of inventors and entrepreneurs who changed the world, and of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. As we travel through the centuries, we'll witness the clash of cultures and the struggles for power and influence, the growth of cities and the rise of industry, the tragedies of war and the triumphs of peace. But most importantly, we'll discover the people behind the events, the heroes and villains, the visionaries and dreamers whose lives and actions shaped the course of American history. So buckle up, get ready for a journey like no other, as we delve into the history of America, a land of endless possibilities and limitless potential. The history of America is a deep well, full of fascinating stories and complex characters. From the indigenous peoples who inhabited the land long before the arrival of European settlers, to the struggles for independence and the civil rights movement, the story of America is one of perseverance, innovation, and above all, resilience. For many, the history of America begins with the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492. However, it is important to note that long before Columbus set foot on American soil, the continent was already home to a diverse array of cultures and civilizations. From the sophisticated societies of the Aztecs and the Incas, to the nomadic tribes of the Great Plains, the indigenous peoples of America had a rich and varied history that is often overlooked in traditional narratives of American history. The arrival of European settlers in the 16th and 17th centuries marked a turning point in American history. The colonists brought with them new ideas, technologies, and ways of life that transformed the continent in profound ways. From the establishment of the first English settlement at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, to the founding of Plymouth Colony by the Pilgrims in 1620, the early years of the colonial era were marked by hardship, disease, and conflict. The arrival of European settlers was not a single event, but rather a series of expeditions and settlements established by different European powers. The Spanish were among the first to arrive, with Christopher Columbus landing in the Caribbean in 1492. The Spanish soon established colonies throughout the Caribbean and Central and South America, bringing with them new technologies, crops, and animals, and engaging in trade with indigenous peoples. The French and English followed the Spanish, establishing settlements in North America. The French established settlements in what is now Canada and along the Mississippi River, while the English established colonies along the eastern seaboard, including Virginia, Massachusetts, and Maryland. The arrival of European settlers had a profound impact on the indigenous peoples of the Americas. European diseases, such as smallpox and measles, devastated indigenous populations, and European colonizers often engaged in violent conflicts with indigenous groups over land and resources. The European colonizers also brought with them new technologies, such as firearms, that gave them a military advantage over indigenous groups. The arrival of European settlers also played a crucial role in the transatlantic slave trade. European powers began to transport enslaved Africans to the Americas to work on plantations, mines, and other industries. The slave trade became a critical part of the European economy and had a significant impact on the economies of the colonies in the Americas. Enslaved Africans were forced to work long hours in grueling conditions, and many died from disease, overwork, or abuse. The American Revolution was a political upheaval that occurred in the 18th century, resulting in the formation of the United States of America. The revolution began in 1765 with the passage of the Stamp Act by the British Parliament, which imposed taxes on legal documents, newspapers, and other printed materials in the American colonies. This act was met with widespread protest and resistance by the American colonists, who believed that they should not be taxed without representation in the British Parliament. The resistance to the Stamp Act set the stage for a series of escalating conflicts between the American colonists and the British government. In 1770, the Boston Massacre occurred, in which British soldiers fired on a crowd of American protesters, killing several people. The incident fueled anti-British sentiment in the colonies and led to increased calls for independence. In 1773, the Boston Tea Party occurred, in which American colonists disguised as native. In 1775, the American Revolution. Americans boarded British ships and dumped tea into the Boston harbor in protest of British taxation policies. The British government responded by passing the Coercive Acts, which closed the port of Boston and placed Massachusetts under military rule. The Coercive Acts sparked outrage throughout the colonies and led to the formation of the First Continental Congress, a meeting of delegates from 12 of the 13 American colonies. The Congress issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which asserted the right of American colonists to govern themselves and demanded that the British government repeal the Coercive Acts. In 1775, the American Revolution officially began with the battles of Lexington and Concord, in which American colonists clashed with British soldiers. The Second Continental Congress was formed, and George Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The war lasted for several years, with the Americans receiving assistance from France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The decisive battle of the war was the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, in which American and French forces defeated the British Army, leading to the eventual surrender of the British and the end of the war. The American Revolution resulted in the formation of the United States of America, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The Revolution had a significant impact on world history, inspiring other nations to fight for their independence and leading to the formation of modern democratic governments. The Civil War was a significant event in American history that took place between 1861 and 1865. It was a war fought between the northern states, known as the Union, and the southern states, known as the Confederacy, over issues such as slavery, states' rights, and the economic and social differences between the two regions. The root cause of the Civil War was slavery. The southern states relied heavily on slave labor for their agricultural industries, while the northern states had abolished slavery and were moving towards an industrialized economy. The issue of slavery divided the nation, and tensions between the North and South grew over the years. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a staunch opponent of slavery, was elected as President of the United States. This led to the secession of several southern states who believed that Lincoln's election threatened their rights to own slaves. The southern states formed their own government, known as the Confederate States of America, and tensions between the two sides continued to escalate. The Civil War officially began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces attacked a Union garrison at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The war was fought in various battles and campaigns throughout the country, with some of the most significant battles including the Battle of Gettysburg, the Siege of Vicksburg, and the Battle of Antietam. The Union Army, led by General Ulysses S. Grant, eventually gained the upper hand in the war, thanks to its superior resources and military strategy. The Confederacy, on the other hand, struggled with issues such as food and supply shortages and a lack of manpower. The Civil War also had a significant impact on American culture and literature, with writers such as Walt Whitman and Herman Melville producing works that reflected the experiences and emotions of the war. The war also led to the expansion of the federal government's power and authority over the states, and the growth of the country's industrial economy. The Civil Rights Movement was a social and political movement in the United States that aimed to end racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans, and to secure legal recognition and federal protection of their basic civil rights. The movement began in the 1950s and continued through the 1960s, with the most significant achievements coming in the latter half of the decade. One of the most influential leaders of the movement was Martin Luther King Jr., who advocated for nonviolent civil disobedience and mass protests to bring attention to the injustices faced by African Americans. King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered during the March on Washington in 1963, became a defining moment of the movement. The civil rights movement gained significant momentum with the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Brown. Board of Education in 1954, which declared segregation in public schools to be unconstitutional. This decision led to a wave of protests and sit-ins in which African Americans peacefully occupied segregated establishments to demand equal treatment. One of the most significant events of the movement was the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, in which African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama refused to ride the city's buses in protest of the segregation policy. The boycott lasted for over a year and eventually led to a Supreme Court decision declaring segregation on buses to be unconstitutional. The movement continued to gain momentum with the Freedom Rides of 1961, in which a group of activists rode buses through the South to challenge segregation on interstate transportation. The Freedom Rides were met with violent resistance, but ultimately helped to bring national attention to the issue of segregation. In 1963, the Birmingham Campaign led to the desegregation of public spaces in Birmingham, Alabama, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The movement faced significant challenges and opposition, including violent repression from law enforcement and white supremacist groups. However, the perseverance and determination of civil rights activists eventually led to significant legal and social changes, paving the way for further progress in the fight for equality. Today, the civil rights movement remains an important symbol of the struggle for justice and equality in the United States, inspiring ongoing efforts to promote social justice and civil rights for all.